this is the cover of the story that we're going to be reading today. And with the split screen, I'm not sure how well I can get that in there, but it's called The Artist. It's a dark Victorian collection short story, Victoriana collection short story. And I'll let you tell us all about it because you know all about your story.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I made that cover myself, and so let me tell you a little bit about the book. We're going to be starting the read right toward the beginning. There will only have been a couple of scenes beforehand, and basically running up to where we are going to pick up to do the live read. Miss Grant is the main character. The whole book is from her perspective. It's a short story. The whole short story is from her perspective. So that's what the narration is, from her perspective. And she has seen an ad in the paper that is a Civil War veteran asking for a companion, asking specifically for a single woman. And he does, assure in his ad that there will be servants, there all the time. The house is never without servants. So, of course, in Victorian times, it would be a problem if you were a woman in a house alone with a man that you're not married to. So, he's making sure that it's safe. Which is already a bad sign in my books. So she goes there and she finds that it's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's on the cliffs, a big house on the cliffs overlooking a gorgeous, oceanscape. And she thinks it's so beautiful, and it takes place in Boston. And she notices that the house looks really out of place because it's red, which doesn't really match with any of the surroundings. It doesn't go with them. Normally you might have beige or blue or green or something like that would go with it. So right off the bat, she's saying, why is there a red house? Why would he do such a thing? That doesn't make any sense. So, that's a bit of foreshadowing. There's a lot of nice, cool air outside. There's lots of wind all the time because we're by the ocean. The windows are all shut. So we're already having some symbolism there. And this scene that we're about to read together picks up right from there. So that's what leads up to it.
Perfect. So the way we're going to do this is Christie's going to be the narrator, and Christie's going to be the voice of Miss Grant.
Miss Grant.
And I'm going to be the voice of Mr. Markham. Yes. And
yes.
I was just thinking the other story of Mr. Markham and Miss Jones. So Miss Jones isn't going to be as old as I make her sound, but that's probably the best you're going to get for a female voice out of me. So I will make her sound a little bit older than she actually is in the story.
I like your female voices, though, especially older female voices.
Yeah,
so I was very excited that you could get the chance to do this.
I wish I could do female voices like my narrator does. He does amazing female voices, like young female voices. So
yeah, he is so outstanding.
Yes.
I know, he's amazing.
I just had a conversation with him today, and he's agreed to do my next 4 books.
Ooh.
Yeah,
that's exciting.
Yeah, it is. It's nice to have the same narrator right through, because I've been bouncing back and forth with. I've got 2 other narrators now. One was amazing, the other one kind of left me in the lurch. So I've had good experiences and bad experiences, and I go with royalty share. So the narrator isn't making a ton of money. So for him, Mikhail, to stay with me is saying something. So he's excited with the story, and he wants to keep being part of it. So hopefully we can make something out of it in the years to come. But anyway, we'll let you get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. All right, here we go. This is toward the beginning of The Artist. The clock ticked loudly in the parlor as Miss Grant and Mr. Markham sat oddly silent, having just met. The servants had accepted her into the house with very little fuss, as if she had been there many times before and was just visiting again. Miss Grant glanced furtively at Mr. Markham. He was young, as the ad said, but as a war veteran, the only injury she could see was a long, deeply indented scar that drew from his left ear straight across his cheek and angled to the bottom of his chin. When she had responded to the veteran's ads in the past, there had always been something more than scars. A missing limb, sometimes 2, heart conditions, permanent shock. But a scar? Was that really all? If so, why had he felt the need to take out an ad for a companion? Surely he had plenty of friends, especially with such good looks. Perfectly straight nose, strong chin, well-balanced lips, and thick brown hair. The wealth she saw in his house was also in his handsome features. His scar didn't mar anything but his skin. But perhaps the problem was underneath it all, inside his soul. If that was the case, she could still try to help. Pursing her lips, Miss Grant wondered why the silence felt commanding, thick. Discomfort overwhelmed the idea of speaking. After a while, Mr. Markham inhaled audibly and said,
Would you like some refreshment before you settle in upstairs?
his voice was scratchy with exhaustion, as if it had been he who had traveled all this way just to be let down. Miss Grant nodded in one clear motion. Yes, that would be nice. Mr. Markham rang a small bell on a little table next to him. The kindly but quiet maid, Mrs. Jones, who had received Miss Grant at the front door.
You may call me Jones, miss.
With an outdated curtsy, discreetly entered the room and closed the door behind her. She couldn't have been older than 40, with a pleasant look despite the lack of a smile on her face. She seemed to approach his chair with caution, bent slightly forward with her hands clasped in her lap, and she stopped where she could just barely see him. She leaned forward to look at him from the right, the side without the scar.
Tea.
He said with unnecessary harsh authority.
Yes, sir.
Jones didn't look at Miss Grant. She simply left carefully and quietly. What a strange place, Miss Grant thought. Silence settled in again with a consistency she could only describe as pudding thick.
Why, miss...
Mr. Markham asked, the quiet so suddenly pierced that it startled Miss Grant. Excuse me?
You've been married before, but you aren't anymore. I made inquiries about you after you wrote me.
Before or after you accepted me to come here? Miss Grant asked quickly.
Both.
Miss Grant's eyebrows rose sharply. Perhaps this was a big mistake. Perhaps she would get out of it in the morning.
Shouldn't you go by Mrs. Montgomery?
He pushed.
Why don't you?
She thought for a moment. You still accepted my application. He glanced at her and grunted.
I need the company.
Why? She asked immediately, feeling put out for coming here to help a man who, as far as she could see, didn't need anything but a way out of his own insecurities. He looked at her full on, and the beauty of his face, even with a frown and a deep scar, was shocking. Her expression must have shown it.
What a shame. That's what you're thinking.
He spat angrily.
He was so handsome. What a shame about his face. I don't need pity. I need companionship.
He looked away, the frown deepening, and now all she could see was a miserable man and the scar that held control over him. Miss Grant's left hand tightened into a fist while her right trembled trying to do so. I would prefer that you avoid putting words in my mouth, she said softly. After thinking about what might help for a moment, she continued, I am a widow, as I'm sure you know.
And your husband survived the war?
The bitterness was shocking for a man with all his limbs and a sharp mind, a man with nothing actually wrong with him. She was not about to continue. Clearly, this was not someone she could trust by any means. But perhaps, Mr. Markham, I would like to paint you. The authority in her voice was more of a command than a request. If he wouldn't help himself, she would stay and try to force him out of his ridiculous behavior. What the servants must have gone through every day was an appalling thought. This man had to be brought out of his own self-pity. The stillness that settled over the room was so painful, Miss Grant was afraid to cross her ankles for fear the subtle sound of her skirts rustling would be too startling.
Paid me?
He said with disgust.
I thought you were joking when you mentioned that in the letter.
No, I really would like to, she said. The door opened and Jones carried in a tray of tea. Miss Grant glanced at the table between her chair and Mr. Markham's, then stood and walked over to Jones, taking hold of the tray. Her right hand struggled to grip it well. Her left hand supported it underneath. Thank you, Jones. You may go now. Jones looked up at her, seemingly terrified of not completing her serving duty.
Oh, miss, I couldn't let you. Go now, Jones, you old rag.
Mr. Markham said, much to Miss Grant's unhappiness.
Now that you've got my guest doing your work, go knit something.
Miss Grant turned harshly and almost threw the service from the tray, but Jones's hand on her arm stopped her from saying anything. Despite his treatment, when Miss Grant looked back into Jones's eyes, she saw softness, and her mouth formed a tight-lipped smile. She saw an apology, and thanks, and something else. Jones was conveying in those warm brown eyes that no matter what Miss Grant did, it would not end well, but it was nice of her to try. Miss Grant swallowed.
Well, is nobody capable of putting down the tea?
Mr. Markham demanded, twisting to see them behind his chair. Gathering herself quickly, Miss Grant turned and put down the service. Impatience will not make anyone move faster, she said. If anything, it makes people drop things more often.
Don't be a fool,
he said, facing forward in his chair again and slumping down. He was really just an ill-mannered child, Miss Grant realized, and he needed to be treated with great helpings of patience and kindness. Although that hadn't worked for... The sound of the door closing drew Miss Grant's attention. Jones was gone.
It'll be cold before I can even stir in the sugar,
Mr. Markham growled. You shouldn't be having sugar if you're an invalid, Miss Grant said, knowing full well he was no invalid. She remained standing and poured with her left hand from behind the table, like a servant.
I did mean literally. I was making a point.
Mr. Markham sneered.
And anyway, did my advertisement mention being an invalid? Of course not.
Miss Grant moved around her chair and sat down, then handed Mr. Markham his tea. Well, if you aren't an invalid, why put out an advertisement for a companion in the first place? She asked. It is clear to me that you're set on considering yourself a poor, broken thing.
I said I don't want to be pitied.
He tried to interrupt, raising his voice. But I have been a companion to men with no legs, men with no arms, men in such shock that they cannot move from their bed, and even men with only half a face left. She paused. Her voice had grown harsher along the way. But perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. And you, she looked him in the eye, have a simple scar that doesn't seem to hinder your mouth from demanding or complaining. Mr. Markham's eyes bore outrage, and his jaw lowered within his closed mouth, but he didn't speak. You are a man obsessed with your own beauty, and that is why you treat others so poorly. You are still in mourning for yourself, your looks. You're trapped in your mind. It would do you good to visit men who left the war far worse than with a marred cheek. At least you still have a cheek. A shocked laugh burst from Mr. Markham's mouth, and he covered it with his hand, his eyebrows forming a straight line in an attempt to become serious again. But she could see on his cheeks, where his hand didn't cover them, that he was smiling despite himself. She sat back with her tea and smiled a small half moon of pleasure with herself for finally saying what was on her mind. Her mother would have spent weeks tisking her for that.
Yeah, you just can't say things like that to me, to anyone,
Mr. Markham said, still on the verge of laughter, but trying so very hard to be serious. But I did, Miss Grant exclaimed, her eyes looking down at her tea. And you're laughing because you know them to be true somewhere inside yourself. You are laughing at your own absurdity and releasing what you've been holding in all this time. She stirred her tea, although there was nothing added to it that required stirring. Now drink up and we'll say no more about it. For now. Mr. Markham's eyes stayed on Miss Grant, but he did sit back, and there was a marked difference in the air between them. It was no longer thick with discomfort and doubt. Respect had taken their place.
Awesome. Good job.
Yeah, that was our excerpt. So thank you so much. That was so cool to hear Mr. Markham read and Jonesy. That was fantastic.
You read that very well.
Oh, thank you.
Especially when you're doing long bouts of text like narration, it's tough to get the words right all the time, I find, anyway, for myself.
I know, and when I record something, I always end up editing a lot. It's better when you get lost in it. Like, this was much nicer than doing it on my own. Doing it with you, it's much
well,
nicer.
That's good, yeah. It's fun getting involved in the voice. Like, when I first did my live reads over a year ago, I just read it. And I read fast, and I just read, I didn't know what I was doing. And as I'm getting better, I think I'm getting better anyway. I started adding some inflection into it, and then now I work with the narrators, like the way Mikhail puts such feeling in his voices. I can't emulate him, but I get the gist of what I should do to make it just a little bit more exciting than just reading flat text, because then it seems like you're reading from a textbook. So you did very well.
Oh, thank you. That was a lot of fun. You even did the cues at the end. That was really
good.
Yeah,
I didn't want to throw you off, though. I was debating whether I should do that or not. I didn't want to throw you off.
That was fantastic. No, I loved it.
So
just for everyone's knowledge, just to mention quickly, Invalid was not an insulting term back then. It was not offensive. It was the historically accurate term that they just used in everyday language. So it's different now, but then that was the way that you were supposed to refer to somebody who was an invalid.